CS161, lecture number 17, low-level network attacks. Announcements.
Homework 5 is due next Monday. So as always, homeworks are due Monday. More design reviews will probably come next week, but if they don't, you can always stop by office hours and talk about your design. Project 2, the design doc draft was due yesterday. If you haven't turned it in, you can use a slip day on it if you want to. But again, it's just a draft, so we're just looking for completion. And as long as you've put in some effort and started on the project, then you should be good to go. And there is an optional lab, but again, due at the end sometime. Okay. So yesterday was the first networking lecture, very exciting. And we basically just did a speed run of what is the internet and how does it work? And there are two kind of really big ideas of the internet that are important to keep in mind. So the first one is layers. So the internet has a lot of different protocols and it's kind of hard to keep track of them. So one way to separate them out and create some organized model of what the internet is to use layers. So the way every layer works is it's kind of like layers of abstraction in a program, or when you're running, like some software, it goes from high level applications down to like bits on your machine. So the internet's kind of the same. The lowest level is physical. So that's just bits moving across the wire or bits moving across radio waves or whatever. So just some physical way that bits are being moved. You can also use like the postal service or carrier pigeons or Pony Express or whatever. But as long as bits can be moved across space, that's layer 1. Layer 2 says, if I have this way to move bits across space, how about I use this layer 1 protocol to connect a bunch of computers in a local area? So maybe all the computers in Soda Hall at Berkeley or all the computers in my apartment building are connected. That creates something called a local area network, and that's layer 2. And there are, again, a bunch of different protocols here. And machines at layer 2 are addressed using something called a MAC address, not to be confused with MACs from the crypto unit. This is an address to refer to machines at the local area network level. And then when we say, okay, well, local area network is great. That lets us connect all the machines in our local area. But what if I want to connect to a machine in another country or on the other side of the world? I can't use a really, really long wire to connect me and somebody in Europe or something. So instead, we have layer 3. So the way layer 3 works is we say I can take 2 local networks. So maybe there's one in this apartment complex and there's one in this apartment complex. And I can actually connect them with just one wire. So all I have to do is create one link between those 2 local networks, and now they're connected. So that creates like a network of networks. So if I just do this for more and more and more apartment complexes and buildings and so on, I eventually get the whole world covered. So that's how layer 3 comes together. So you take like one local network in one apartment complex, you connect it to like a post office, or a router is what it's called in internet terms. And that router is connected to other local area networks. So you get this kind of graph structure of a bunch of local area networks connected by routers. And now if I want to send a message to someone in Europe or Australia or whatever, I can hop across different local networks until I hit the destination that I want. So that's global packet delivery, and that's layer 3. And you can see how it's built on layer 2. So if it weren't for layer 2 giving us connected computers, layer 3 could not happen. So you're building your way up. And at layer 3, you have something called IP, which we'll talk about more later, but this is the addressing system for machines here. So IP is used to address systems globally, and MAC addresses are used to address systems locally. So that's how those work. And then we'll talk about layers 4 and 7 later, but you can see how we're starting to build from the lower layers higher up. So that was all last time. And I think the other kind of big idea of networking that is not quite on this slide, but you did see it yesterday, was headers. So every message on the internet is split into packets. So a packet is one chunk of information being sent across the internet. And the internet is just lots of packets flying back and forth everywhere. And every packet usually has a header, and the header tells us some information like how long is the packet, or what's inside the packet, or who is this packet from and who is this packet going to. So it's kind of like the envelope on your letter, right? It tells you where it's from, who it's going to, and any information like that. So packets always have headers, and usually there's one header per layer, as you also saw yesterday. So those are kind of the big ideas of networking. And then we're now going to see all of those kind of in action as we talk about a bunch of different attacks. Okay, that was my long review. So today is finally all about attacks. So yesterday we talked about how the internet works. And today we can finally start talking about some different attacks. So we're going to start low and then build our way up. So if you remember this diagram, we're going to start down here with 1 and 2, and then we're going to slowly move our way up until we hit 7. And then when we hit 7, 7 is basically like the web. So that'll kind of connect the web and networking section. So the web was at the top and the networking is at the bottom. Then we'll move until they touch together. Okay. So that's today. Before we start talking about attacks, we have to talk about attackers. If you remember the first lecture, it was all about know your threat model. We have to know who is attacking us and what models do we have or what assumptions can we make about our attackers. So in networking, there are 3 types of attackers we care about. So here they are. They're called the man-in-the-middle attacker. We've seen this one before. The on-path attacker and the off-path attacker. So the man-in-the-middle attacker is kind of similar to crypto in that you can modify any packet you see. You can delete packets. You can add your own packets. So you can modify things. And you can also read packets as they are sent across the internet. Then there's the on-path attacker who cannot modify anything. So they're not allowed to modify or drop packets, but they can read anything that's going over the internet. So this is kind of like the eavesdropper in crypto. Right? So the man in the middle is Mallory, who can modify and read. And then the on-path attacker is like Eve, who can only read. And finally, there's the off-path attacker. This one's kind of weird because this attacker, they can't modify packets and they can't read packets either. But it turns out these type of attackers can actually still do attacks on you. So we'll have to consider off-path attackers as well. Okay, so we'll see much more of this later, but just to keep in mind, there are 3 different attackers. And all of them have one extra power that we have to consider in our threat model, and that's called spoofing. So one thing to realize about the network is that anybody can send packets through the network. So you can send packets, I can send packets. There's no restriction on who cannot send packets. As long as you're connected to the internet, you can send your own packets anywhere you want. And in fact, you can actually lie about whatever you want in the packet. So there's no like god of the internet somewhere checking every packet to make sure that no one's lying. If you lie, no one's going to catch you unless we implement protections. So this is called spoofing. And spoofing basically says you send a message, but you pretend that you're somebody else when you're sending it. So for example, Mallory sends a message, but she claims this is a message from Alice. So she sends a packet into the internet and it heads off somewhere to Bob or something. And on the packet, it says, this message came from Alice. So even though it came from Mallory, she takes the source address and swaps it out for Alice. So now it looks like this packet came from Alice, even though it's from Mallory. So that's spoofing. And because anybody can send packets, anybody can spoof. So the man in the middle can spoof, the on-path attacker can spoof, and the off-path attacker can also spoof. So that's something we have to watch out for. Okay. And I think we'll also see that in some cases, spoofing attacks can be harder, but again, everyone can, in theory, do this. Okay, so now you might be wondering, why did we choose this kind of threat model? So that's always a good question is, if we're assuming there are man in the middle, on path, off path, why did we categorize attackers like this? Was there a reason? And it turns out there is, because you can see a lot of these attackers in the real world. So here are some examples of how you might be an on-path attacker. This one's at a very low level. It's at layer 1. So in fact, at layer 1, you can actually take special hardware devices and you can use them to measure what bits are being transmitted. So I think this one on the left is like a plugin that you plug into, I guess, the wire, and then try and read the voltage levels across the wire to figure out what's going on. I think this one is just reading maybe radio waves. I don't know. But basically, if you can actually use kind of like hacker devices to read what's going on as the bits are being transmitted across space. So this is attacking at the very lowest layer, right? Here's another example of a layer 1 attack. this one, it's kind of funny. So in the Cold War, what happened was there are cables under the ocean. So part of the way that messages are carried across oceans is there are these long cables that are sunk to the bottom of the ocean, and then a lot of bits move through them. So what I guess the US did was we sent divers down to the bottom of the ocean, and we found the cable that's being used to send, I guess, secret Soviet communications. And we just installed a little device on the cable to read the voltage levels. And now we are reading bits. So that makes the United States an on-path attacker. And I guess if you ever go to Moscow, you can actually see this little device. So that's another fancy way to become an on-path attacker. And that's at layer 1. So there are also ways to do this at layer 2. So remember, layer 2 is the local area network. So we have all these computers and they're all linked up with a wire or some other layer 1 protocol. Now, again, because this is a local network, anybody can send packets to anybody else. And some of the LANs, especially older ones, use something called broadcast technology. So what broadcast means is every packet gets sent to everyone. So there's no notion of like A sends a message directly to B and nobody else can see it. Because everybody is connected up with the same wire, everybody can see every message. And it's kind of an agreement between every machine that if the message says it's meant for someone else, I'm just going to quietly ignore it. So if A sends a message to B, everybody will see the packet, but C and D will see, oh, this packet is meant for B, so I'm not going to read it because I'm a good citizen. But of course, you can decide to be a not good citizen, and you can break this agreement and say, well, I'll just read the packet anyway, right? It was sent to me because it's a broadcast technology, so I don't have to follow my agreement. I'll just read it. And this is sometimes called promiscuous mode. And again, this makes you an on-path attacker because you're reading messages that were meant for other people. Great. So you can actually try this at home. I wouldn't try this on other people because it's very illegal and bad and all that stuff. But it is theoretically possible, and there's an application for it called TCP dump. So this actually just takes packets on the local network, even if they're meant for someone else. TCP dump just says, you know what, I'll read it anyway, might as well. And that lets us read packets that are meant for other people, and it makes us an on-path attacker. And if you don't want to stare at this blob of text, you can also use some interface like Wireshark. So that's another way you can become an on-path attacker today. And there are even more. So this one, I think, is something that Nick Weaver, the other instructor, is quite fond of. There are some devices on layer 2 where if you send a message to the device, you can actually kind of rig it so that not only does the message go to its intended recipient, but it also creates a copy of the message and sends it to you, the attacker. So that's another way you can become an on-path attacker. And I think this device can also be used to modify packets. So if you want to modify the packet while it's here and change it from hi to bye or something, you could do that too. So that would make you a man-in-the-middle attacker if you chose to do that. So that's the name of the thing if you want to go out and buy one for whatever reason. Apparently it's around $200. So we can't lend you the money, but it's up to you. And the fact that I guess he really wants you to know is that it's powered with USB. So sure. Okay, back to actual content. So those are the attackers. Now we know what the threat model is like and kind of why we're using that threat model. So now we can finally start talking about our very first protocol and our very first attack. Exciting. Okay, so really quickly, just one more time, this is layer 2 and layer 3. Layer 2 is one of these. So just a bunch of computers connected up, that's layer 2. And this uses MAC addresses to identify devices. Then there's layer 3, which says, here's a local network. Here's another local network. I'm going to connect them together with a router. And that's the internet, which is layer 3. And on layer 3, we use IP addresses to identify people. So that's a really quick review. Now, there are 2 different addressing systems. And you might notice a natural thing to want is a way to translate between those 2. So that's what Address Resolution Protocol, or ARP or ARP, is for. Basically, it translates layer 3 IP addresses into layer 2 MAC addresses. So maybe Alice wants to send a message to Bob, but Alice only knows Bob's IP address. But because we're on the local network, we want to use MAC addresses, or maybe I want to use a layer 2 protocol. So I have to figure out if the IP address is this, what's the corresponding MAC address? And that's what ARP is going to do for us. So there are 4 steps to this. You can read them here, but I'll draw them in pictures for you. So here we go. Again, I know Bob's IP address. I think that should say 1234, but I want to know Bob's MAC address, or Alice wants to know Bob's MAC address. So the first thing Alice does is checks her cache. So everyone has a cache, and this is just to prevent having to use this protocol over and over again. So I save previous mappings that I've seen before. So I check, have I ever seen this IP address before? And if I have, do I already know the MAC address? So I check my cache. And in this case, the cache is empty. There's nothing inside. So I have to keep going. But if Bob's MAC address was already here, then I could stop right here and I'd be done. Okay, next, now I have to make a request to find out. So I don't know where Bob is. If I knew where Bob is, I would know his MAC address, right? The MAC address tells us which machine is Bob. But I don't know which one is Bob because I don't have his MAC address. So what do? Well, the answer is kind of stupid, but it works. I just ask everybody. So I just say, does anyone know what the MAC address of this thing is? That should really say 1.2.3.4, but oh well. So Alice asks everyone. So she just sends a message to everyone. And if you remember those broadcast technologies from earlier, this is a broadcast. So I send it to everybody and I say, does anybody know what the MAC address of 1.2.3.4 is? So I don't know who any of these people are, but I'll ask Bob, I'll ask Charlie, I'll ask Dave, I'll ask the router. So everyone gets my question. And in theory, only one person should respond. And that person would be Bob. So Bob will say, oh, that's me. I'm the 1.2.3.4 person. If I quickly close and reopen, maybe the numbers will magically match up again. Let's see. Okay, let's try doing that. So, okay, that works. So again, Alice asks everyone on the network, so she just yells like, does anyone know this? And then Bob is the only person who should respond because Bob has the IP address 1234. So Bob says, oh, that's me, hello. And then Bob responds with his MAC address. And notice everybody else does nothing because Charlie isn't 1234, Dave isn't 1234, and the router isn't 1234. So they see this request and they're like, that's not me. I don't care, so I'll ignore it. And Bob is the only person who answers. And now Bob answers with his MAC address. So Alice can now add to her cache and say, well, and now I know that this IP address corresponds to this MAC address. And if she ever needs it again in the future, she can just look it up. So she doesn't have to repeatedly bother everyone. So that's it for ARP. It's really kind of simple, right? All you have to do is, if you don't know, just ask everyone and hope that one person gives you the answer, and that's it. And there are a couple kind of funny exceptions. So if Bob is not inside the local area network, so Bob is actually someone on a different local area network, then the person who is responsible for responding is the router. And the reason why is because, So the reason why is because if Alice wanted to send a message to Bob and Bob is on a different network, then Alice should send a message to the router and the router will take that message and forward it to wherever Bob is. So that's why the router would technically respond if Bob is outside of the network. Okay, and then again, the router can take the packet and then pass it on to whoever is closer to Bob. Okay, and then again, all responses are cached. A kind of funny exception is even if you don't make a request and someone just decides to tell you their IP address or their MAC address, you'll cache that anyway because any information is helpful. So if Bob feels very bored today and just wants to tell everyone what his MAC address is, you'll probably cache that too. Okay, so that's ARP. Now we have to start thinking about attacks. So here again is our protocol from earlier. So again, I check the cache. I don't see anything in the cache. And I have to make a request. One different thing here is Dave has left the building and Mallory is now here. So now we have to contend with an attacker. So again, we ask everybody, what's the MAC address, right? I just ask everybody. Now, if you were Mallory, what is something you could try to do at this point? Does anyone have a strategy or ideas? Right, you could just pretend to be Bob, right? Sorry. Okay. I guess one good thing about Zoom is you can mute yourself as you're hideously coughing. So yeah, everyone says you could just pretend to be Bob, right? So what happens now is Alice doesn't know which one of these is Bob. So what Mallory can do is she can say, I'm Bob. So she's lying and saying, yeah, that's me, I'm Bob. My IP is this. It's not, but she can lie and say it is. And here's my MAC address, which is a lot of sixes, which in networking terminology, I guess is evil because sixes are evil numbers or something. And Bob is also going to send the response because Bob is legitimate and will try to answer. So there's going to be two responses going back to Alice. And what Mallory has to ensure is that her answer gets there first. So if you think about it, Alice is only expecting one answer, right? She does not expect two people to have this IP address. Only one person should ever have this IP address. So she expects one answer. She's never going to expect two because that would be super weird. So whatever answer she gets, she'll accept it. So all Mallory has to do if she wants to lie is just beat Bob. So Mallory's answer gets there first. Alice is like, oh, this is Bob, IP address is this, MAC address is this. And Alice will accept it even though Bob's answer is still on its way. And then by the time Bob's answer gets there, Alice is like, what? Another one? Well, that's kind of weird. I'll just ignore it. So that's what happens. And then Mallory's IP address or Mallory's MAC address is now in the cache, mapping to Bob's IP address. So that's all you have to do to attack ARP. And the main reasons why this was allowed to happen is because first, Alice has no way of verifying the response. So whatever response she gets, there's no cryptography, there's no signing, there's no trust. So whatever she gets, she just kind of has to accept it as true. And also, this lets us spoof things, right? So now anybody can claim to have the requested IP address, and there's no way of Alice knowing, has this person lied or is this person being honest? There's no way of checking. So that's one reason why ARP is possible. Another reason is, like we said, we're only expecting one machine to respond. So whatever comes first, I will take it because I do not expect the second answer. So I'll just take whatever comes first. That creates something called a race condition. So you're racing against the attacker. So it's kind of attacker versus legitimate person. So Mallory versus Bob. If Mallory's answer gets there first, Alice will just accept Mallory's answer and ignore Bob. If Bob's answer gets there first, Alice will accept Bob's answer and then ignore Mallory. So Mallory does need to respond faster than Bob. And sometimes this is it requires Mallory to get lucky or to have special hardware or something to get to Alice first. But that's a race condition and it comes up a lot in networking attacks. So the requirement for ARP spoofing is you have to be in the same local area network as Alice, right? Because you have to be able to see when Alice makes the request and you have to be able to make the response. So you do have to be in the same local area network. It doesn't really make sense to inject an answer from a different network. But once you successfully inject an answer or spoof an answer, you actually, or Mallory becomes a man-in-the-middle attacker. And why is that? Because now Alice thinks that Bob's MAC address is this, which is Mallory's MAC address. So if Alice ever sends a message to Bob, where does it go? It actually goes to Mallory because of this malicious answer. So Mallory gets every message meant for Bob, and she can receive it, tamper with it, change it, delete it, or do whatever she wants, and then forward the modified message to Bob. So this lets Mallory become a full man in the middle. Okay. I think that's it for ARP. Any questions before we talk about defenses? And yeah, someone mentioned something about subnets, but we can talk about those offline. This is definitely a little bit simplified because network protocols are kind of complicated, but the idea is basically the same. So you yell at everyone for the answer. One person is supposed to respond, but anybody can lie and respond as long as their answer gets there first. Okay, so there are a couple of defenses that help. The main one is called switches. And basically switches are a tool for us to avoid having to broadcast requests all over the place. Because the main problem here was that I was asking everyone and whoever answered first was the answer I accept. So I should avoid broadcasting whenever I can so that I'm not at risk of receiving a bunch of bogus answers. So that's what switches are for. And the idea is if I want to send a message to Bob, instead of broadcasting the request or anything, I find a switch, which is a special machine on the local area network, and I send a message directly to the switch. So I say, hi, switch, here's a message for Bob. And the switch will also have a cache of IPs and MACs. But because everybody is using the switch, it has a very large cache. So Alice, Bob, Charlie, Dave, Evan, I can't think of an F name. Everyone is using the switch to send messages. So this cache actually has like the combination of where everyone is. And it's actually a very strong cache, and it usually knows where everyone is. So this also means that Faith, I guess, is a F name, sure. But yeah, the switch maintains a very large cache. And if Bob's MAC address is in the cache, the switch can just directly send a message to Bob. So even if Alice doesn't know Bob's MAC address directly, she can ask the switch, and then the switch will send a message for her. So she's avoided having to make a broadcast request. And if for some reason the switch doesn't know, then the switch will say, okay, I don't know, so let's just broadcast the message. And hopefully a good switch will have a very large cache, so it won't have to broadcast that often. So this method is a little bit better than before because I'm not just randomly asking people to give me their MAC address. I'm actually asking a switch, which will have a larger cache. There are also some other side benefits. So again, we talked about security. There are fewer broadcast messages. And that also means there are fewer opportunities for an on-path attacker to read a message or to do ARP spoofing. And there's also an efficiency benefit to this, which is, well, a broadcast message is kind of expensive because I have to send a message to everyone, right? So it's like Alice to Bob, Alice to Charlie, Alice to Dave. That takes a lot of resources to send a message like that. So fewer broadcast requests actually lets us send more messages per second because messages are being sent directly to the recipient and not just being sent to anyone. And finally, there's something which is isolation. So if you have a large local area network, maybe you have some machines that are very sensitive and they have to be secured. Then there are some machines where if it gets hacked, I don't care. So there are smarter switches called virtual local area networks. And what these do is they split a network into several isolated parts so that if you're on one part of the virtual LAN, you can't actually interact with other parts. So you can use this to take a gigantic network like AirBears 2, which is the horrible Berkeley Wi-Fi network. And you can split it and say, well, the research machines in Berkeley are very sensitive. I don't want people touching those. So I'll split those into its own secure local network. And then everyone in the dorms everyone's pirating stuff and they're visiting virus websites. So we'll take that unsecured cesspool and give it its own part of the local area network as well. So I can isolate different parts of the network using the smarter switch as well. So switches are very good and they help us defend things at layer 2. There's also one kind of second defense if you want more. And there are tools like ARP Watch. So what this does is it monitors everything over the network. And if it sees something very fishy, it'll notify you. So for example, something very fishy would be if I make an ARP broadcast request and I get 2 answers. That's very strange because I'm only supposed to get 1. So ARP Watch will watch the network for things like 2 responses to 1 request and let us know that, hey, something may have gone wrong here. So you can also use something like ARP Watch to help you. But these are the 2 main defenses. And I think that's the end of ARP. Does anyone have final questions? Okay, so the next protocol, moving right along, is called Dynamics Host Configuration Protocol. By now, I think you noticed that there are just a bunch of different acronyms for everything because everything in network is just like a pile of letters. So that kind of sucks, but we'll have to deal with it. And you do have cheat sheets, so you can always just write all this stuff on your cheat sheet. So we don't really care what it stands for, but DHCP is the name of this one. And DHCP, what it's used for is initial network configuration. So if you think about it, if I want to connect to the network, there's a couple things that I need. I need an IP address. So I have to have my own address so that other people can talk to me, right? If I don't have an address, how will you send messages to me? You can't. You also need an IP address of a DNS server. We'll talk about DNS next week, so hold on to this for now, but just know that I do need an IP address to a DNS server, and the DNS server will answer an important question for me. And then I need the IP address of the router or the gateway so that the user can contact machines outside of the local area network. So I have this local network, but I may want to talk to computers outside of the local network. So I need to know of all the machines on this network, which one is the router or the gateway to the rest of the internet so that it can hop more hops across the internet. So I also have to know who that is. So those are the main things I have to know. But the problem is the first time you connect to the network, Like, I don't know what any of this is because I just connected. So I'm like, hi, I'm new here. I don't know what any of this is. And even worse, I don't know who to ask because I'm brand new. I've never, I don't have an address. I don't have anyone's address. So I don't even know who to ask because I'm so clueless. So that's a problem. And DHCP is a solution to give us a configuration when we first join and we have no idea what's going on. Okay, so here's the steps again. Here they are in words, but we'll draw it in diagrams because I like pictures. So here we go again. Here's Alice. Alice, it is her first time connecting to the network, so she has no IP address. She has no idea where the DNS server is, and she has no idea where the gateway is. So she has no idea where anything is, and she has no idea who to contact for any of this stuff. So again, if you think back to ARP, when you don't know and you don't know who to ask, the best thing you can do is just basically yell at everyone and say, hello, does anyone know? Right, so you just yell at everyone and say, hi, anybody help, please. So she broadcasts this request to everybody because she has no idea who she should be asking, so may as well ask everyone. And the hope is that only the right people respond. So any DHCP server, so these are special machines on the local area network that are designed to answer these questions, will respond with an offer. So the DHCP server says, well, I can help you. I can give you this IP address. You can use this DNS server, and you can use this gateway. And it's possible that more DHCP servers respond. So here's another one. This one says, I can use this IP address, this DNS server, and this gateway. So if there are multiple DHCP servers, multiple of them can answer, but usually there's only one. So in this diagram, there's two, but in most cases, there's only one. And usually, I think it's not on here, but there's usually an expiry date on this information. So the DHCP server says, you can use this IP address, but a week from now, you have to give it back and ask for another one. So just to make sure things are cycling and no one's hogging IPs, there usually is an expiration date. Okay, so that's the offer. And notice that the offers are not broadcast, right? They're sent directly to Alice. So they all see that Alice is the one asking for help, and then they send an answer directly to Alice. Okay. The next step is called client request. So now Alice has gotten a bunch of offers, usually just one, but she can also get multiple. And she has to pick one, right? She doesn't need multiple, she just needs one. So she'll pick one. And because multiple people could have made an offer, she needs to tell everyone which one she chose. So this is actually broadcast, and she'll tell everyone, I'll use DHCP server 1. Thanks, everyone. Right? And this is important because DHCP server 2 has to know to ignore or discard its offer. So now DHCP server 2 can give that offer to somebody else because Alice didn't choose DHCP server 2. Now DHCP server 1 has to save that configuration and give it to Alice because Alice said, I want to use that one. So this is broadcast because, again, I have to tell everyone which one I chose so that the people who were not chosen can discard their offers. And finally, DHCP server 1 now reserves this IP, this gateway, and this DNS server for Alice. So DHCP server 1 knows I cannot give these to anyone else because they're currently being used by Alice. And Alice will also confirm that these are being used. And the DHCP server will finally give an acknowledgement. So the acknowledgement just says, OK, I confirm this is for you. So just to double check, yes, you chose DHCP server 1. Right, so I chose DHCP server 1. And DHCP server 1 confirms, yes, that's all good. Nothing has gone wrong. And this configuration is for you. Now Alice has an IP to use, a DNS server, and a gateway. So that's DHCP. If you squint at it a little bit, you can notice this is basically the same as ARP, right? Again, if I don't know, I just ask everyone, and I get one answer back. The only difference with DHCP is that because I can get multiple answers back, I need to always broadcast which one I chose, and then that person needs to confirm with me that we're good. So it's like ARP, but there's a step 3 and a step 4 because I have to pick one. So that's DHCP. As we talked about, it's very similar to ARP or ARP. So that also means the attacks are very similar and the vulnerabilities are very similar. So instead of asking, we'll just go through it again. Again, Alice has no way of verifying that this is a real response. So an attacker could just give a fake response, just like ARP, where the attacker could give a fake MAC address. In DHCP, Alice can or Mallory can just give Alice a fake configuration. And again, we said usually there's only one DHCP server per network. So I usually only expect one answer, and I'm not going to sit there waiting for 10 people to give me offers. I'll usually just take the first one because I don't expect more. So again, that creates a race condition. Whoever shows up first will usually be the one who's chosen. So if the attacker can get a configuration to Alice before the real DHCP server, then Alice will have to accept that. And again, Mallory has to be in the same local network to give Alice a bunch of configurations. And again, if you succeed, you also Mallory becomes the man-in-the-middle attacker. So one way you can become a man-in-the-middle is claim that the gateway router is your address. So Mallory says, here's my configuration, and then Mallory has to provide a gateway router address, but she actually provides her own address. So now what happens is any message that's bound for the rest of the internet always goes to the router, right? We said the router is the one who's going to hop that message to other places. So if Mallory claims that the gateway router's address is her address, then every time Alice sends a message to the internet, it actually goes to Mallory first. And again, Mallory can tamper with it, change it, delete it before sending it forward to its destination. You can also do this with the DNS server, and I think we'll see that next week, but just hold on to that one for now. So this slide is almost identical to the ARP slide because the idea is the same. So again, you spoof by claiming to have an answer even though you're an attacker, and you exploit a race condition where the first response is always taken, so just make sure that your response arrives first. And the reason why ARP and DHCP are so similar and they have the same vulnerabilities is because they're both broadcast protocols. So again, we always ask anybody for help and we don't care who answers. So that's part of the reason why these are vulnerable. And also there's no trust anchor. So you're wondering, maybe instead of broadcasting, why don't I just ask the right person? The problem is there's no trust anchor. I don't know who to ask and I don't know who to trust. So there's no way to verify that responses are legitimate. So those are the main reasons why ARP and DHCP are similar and they have the same vulnerabilities. So DHCP defenses, unfortunately, are not quite as good as ARP in that there are basically no great ones. And the reason why this is so hard to defend against is there's just no root of trust. So the first time I connect, I don't trust anybody because I don't know who anybody is. I don't know who to ask. I just have to accept whoever gives me the first answer because I don't trust anyone. So that makes DHCP very hard to defend against. And in practice, the defense is basically just not defend against it and say, well, okay, DHCP defenses happen. They're a fact of life. So let's use higher layer protocols to defend against DHCP. So we'll see that when we talk about higher layers. There are some protocols where we use some cryptography to make sure that we're talking to the right person and that there's no man in the middle. So we'll deal with that later. But for now, on its own, DHCP is kind of hard to defend against. So a very short slide here. Someone asked, can we just do a switch for the DHCP server? That's a good question. The switch works in ARP because in ARP, you're trying to reduce the number of broadcast requests to ask for where someone's MAC address is. So you keep a central cache. I'm not sure that quite works for DHCP because, again, you have to ask where the initial configuration is because this is your first time ever connecting. So you have no idea who to even ask. So I don't know if a switch would help because I guess you would not even know where the switch is to ask, I guess. Maybe Nicola has a better answer, but that's my intuition here is that you just don't know who to ask. That's a good question though. But yeah, I don't think switches quite work here, unfortunately, because again, it's your first time, you have no one to trust. So you're kind of stuck. Any other last DHCP questions before we do a 5-minute break? Okay, I think that's it for now. So we'll take a 5-minute break and then come back at, what time is it? It's 4:21, so we'll come back at 4:26. Okay, and we're back right on time, and people on the recording will have no idea how late we were. Okay, so the last low-level attack for today is done on wireless local networks. So this is Wi-Fi, and I'm sure everyone's heard of Wi-Fi before. Now we'll finally figure out what Wi-Fi is. So Wi-Fi is actually a layer 2 protocol that wirelessly connects machines in a local area network. So as we said, there are lots of different ways to connect machines. We can use wires or radio waves or something. And Wi-Fi is the wireless version of the layer 2 protocol. The alternative you might have heard of is Ethernet. So that uses actual wires to connect machines. So if anyone still has like an Ethernet port on their computer, that is the other common layer 2 protocol. So there are several parts of a Wi-Fi network that are worth knowing before we go into this protocol. There's something called an access point, and this is a machine that's sitting on the network, and its only goal is to help people connect to the network. So when you want to connect to the Wi-Fi network, you're going to talk to this access point, and they're going to give you all the information you need to connect to the network. And every Wi-Fi network has a name. So this is the SSID, or like a server set identifier. So again, acronyms, there are a lot of them. But if your Wi-Fi network has a name like AirBears2 or CalVisitor, that's the SSID. And optionally, Wi-Fi networks can have a password to help secure communications. And that's what we're going to look at next. But this is kind of the general structure of a Wi-Fi network. So the protocol for securing a Wi-Fi connection is called WPA2. Again, it stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access 2, but you don't really have to know that. And the goal here is now we're going to use cryptography to secure Wi-Fi network communications at layer 2. And I think it's called WPA2 because there was an older version and it's no longer as secure. So the new version has a 2 in front of it. It's the sequel. So there are a couple of goals we want when we're designing WPA2. Everyone who has the Wi-Fi password should be able to join the network. That makes sense, right? If I have the Wi-Fi password, I can use the Wi-Fi. Any messages sent over the network should be encrypted with a key. So that way, an attacker who doesn't know the password cannot read messages sent over the network. So we're trying to stop attackers who do not have the password, but want to use the network or want to read messages that are sent over the network. And that's our goal for WPA2. So how is this actually going to work? The way it works is a handshake. This handshake is so big that I had to, unfortunately, exceed this boundary here, but oh well. So again, we said there's a client. This is the person who's trying to connect, and the access point, which is the machine on the network whose goal is to help us connect. So here's the handshake. Here we go. The first thing that happens is I make a request. I say, hello, I'm trying to connect to the Wi-Fi network. So the client sends this to the access point. Now, the access point and the client should both know the Wi-Fi password, right? The access point is on the network, so they know the Wi-Fi password. If you are authorized to connect, you'll know the password here. If you're not authorized, you will not know the password here. But assuming we are authorized, we'll use the Wi-Fi password to derive something called the pre-shared key, or the PSK. And I think the algorithm for this is actually password-based key derivation function, or PBKDF2, which is what you saw in project 2, but that's not too important. Basically, I take the password and I use it to create a key called the pre-shared key. And when we talked about how networking has a lot of acronyms, get ready for even more acronyms because this one is absolutely insane in how much acronyms there are. But we'll try to color code them for you so that you don't have to worry about too many of them. Okay, now that you both have a pre-shared key, we're going to exchange nonces. So these are random numbers that are generated every single time. Access point sends one called A nonce, client sends one called S nonce. I actually don't know why it's called S, but that's okay. Now, supplicant, okay, supplicant, okay. So now the next thing we're going to do is generate another key. So we're going to take the key from before, right? This is the pre-shared key that came from the Wi-Fi password. We're going to take the nonces, which are the random values, and we're going to throw in the MAC addresses of the client and the AP just for fun. And now we're going to use these to get something called PTK, which is pairwise transport keys. Again, just too many acronyms, but one way I like to remember this is, so you see how this one's blue, you can see how this one's red. And if you remember back to your like third grade color theory classes, what do you get when you take blue and red and put them together? You get purple. So this is the purple key. Okay, very high quality. So you use the Wi-Fi password to derive blue. The red are the random nonces, and then you take red and blue and put them together and you get purple. Okay. Now, once you're done here, you still have to check one last thing, which is, sorry, let me go back here for a second. You have no idea whether someone tampered with these nonces. They were sent in plain text. There's no encryption on these nonces or anything. So it's possible that there was some man in the middle in the network who swapped out the A nonce or the S nonce. Right? It's also possible that this client didn't actually know the password, or they put in the wrong password, or they typed it wrong, or they're lying that they know the password. So maybe they don't know this password, and they actually got the wrong PTK here, right? Because PTK, which is purple, comes from blue. So if I have the wrong blue, I'll have the wrong purple. So it's possible that the client actually has the wrong purple here. So I need to check that the client has the right purple, and I have to check that these reds were not tampered with. So the way I'll do that is I will go back to crypto unit and I'll think about MACs, which are the message authentication codes to help us prevent tampering. And now the acronyms have gotten so bad that there are two different things with the same acronym. So MACs from the crypto unit and MAC addresses. And that's horrible. So we're going to just do a slight renaming here. The MACs that were message authentication codes from crypto have now been renamed message integrity codes, or MICs. So there you go. In crypto literature, most people still call them MACs, but because WPA already has something called the MAC address, we're going to rename them MICs. Isn't that great? So basically, we just exchange message integrity or message authentication codes, and this helps us ensure that nobody has tampered with the nonces. And these codes use the purple key. So if the client had the wrong blue key, blue is used to make purple, so they'll have the wrong purple key. And if they have the wrong purple key, these MICs will also fail. So this helps us check that the client has the right password and that the nonces have not been tampered with. So that's step 5. And because there were not enough acronyms, I will give you just one more. So this one is the GTK, or the group temporal key, I guess. So the access point will encrypt this and then send it. And we'll see how this is used for broadcasts in like one slide. And then at the very end, just to make sure everything is done and we're all done and there's nothing more to be done, there's an acknowledgement. So this is just the client telling the access point, I received the GTK, I have the purple PTK, I have the green GTK, we're all good. Thank you for your help. Bye. And that's the ACK at the end. Okay, so this is the handshake. It's very large and there's a lot going on, and I will try to explain it a bit more, but we'll see. Okay. Basically, again, the idea here is that the core idea here is that everyone is deriving secret keys to communicate. So there's kind of a chain from the password all the way to the final keys. So the chain goes like this. You start with the Wi-Fi password and you get the PSK, which is the blue one. It stands for something, but I don't care. It's the blue one. Then I take the blue, I mix it with random nonces, and I throw in the MAC addresses if I want to, and I get purple because blue and red makes purple. So this is the purple one. Once I have the purple one, I can use the purple one to encrypt and authenticate all future communication. So this is the actual key that I'm going to use to send messages on the Wi-Fi network. So if I ever want to send a message to the Wi-Fi network, I will encrypt it with the PTK and send it to the access point. Now, one thing to note here is that this is actually a different key for every user because of the nonces. So if you perform this handshake twice, you're going to get different keys every time, even if the Wi-Fi password is the same. And the reason is because there are nonces that are different every time. So this also makes it so that if you're one user and you're not an attacker, you can't read messages sent by other users because they're using a different purple key because they have different nonces. So if everyone used the same blue key, then everyone could decrypt everyone else's messages, which is not great. So we add the nonces so that everyone has a different purple key. And now if you want to read someone else's message, well, they encrypted it with their different purple key, so you won't be able to do that. And finally, there was one last key. So this one was the green one. The access point encrypts and sends the GTK. I just noticed that G stands for green, so I must be a genius. But this key is used to send messages that are broadcast to the whole network. So just like in Ethernet or all those other layer 2 protocols, sometimes I just have to broadcast and ask everyone for something, or I want to announce something to everyone and I want to broadcast the message to everyone. Well, broadcasting is going to be a problem with these purple keys because everyone's purple key is different. So how do I broadcast? So the way I broadcast is everyone agrees on a single shared GTK, which is the group key. And if I want to broadcast, I use the GTK. So this way, because everyone's using the same GTK to broadcast and everyone knows the GTK, I can always decrypt messages that have been broadcast. So this green one, the group key is for broadcasting. Okay, so this is already kind of complicated, but one thing to notice here, if you go all the way back, is there's a lot of messages going back and forth, right? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 messages. That's a lot. And if I'm connecting to a network, I really don't want to have to go back and forth seven different times. That's a lot of work. So I'm actually going to try to simplify it a little bit. So what you're about to see is the optimized version. And this is the exact same logic as here. So again, I use password to get blue. I use blue and red, which is the nonsense, to get purple. I encrypt messages with purple, and I use the green to broadcast messages. But the next slide, all we're doing here is just decreasing the number of messages going back and forth just for efficiency. So this is the exact same thing. If this last slide didn't make sense to you, feel free to just stick with this. But if you want to see how it's optimized, this is the optimized version. So again, client access point. And we're going to try to minimize the number of arrows going back and forth here, right? So I don't want 7, I want fewer than 7. And this slide already kind of spoils you that. We're going to get it down to 4. So the authentication request still has to be made. I still have to say, hi, I want to connect to the network. So that can't be avoided. But now we're still going to derive blue from the password. So that still happens. I'm still going to send the nonce. So that is still the same as before. But here comes the different part, right? So now the client has the blue key and the client has red. That's actually enough to come up with the purple, right? Sorry, I forgot my colors for a second. So the client has derived blue. The client has received its part of the red. So now it can actually create the purple key already, right? The client will also generate its own nonce, but it will do so, like the client's the one doing it, so it already knows its nonce, right? So the client generates the final nonce. Now it has everything it needs. It has blue, it has purple, or it has blue, it has red, and that's enough to give me purple. So the client derives purple right now, even though the second nonce has not been exchanged yet. Now I can combine. So now I'm doing some optimization. Not only am I sending the S nonce, I'm also sending the message integrity code at this point because I already have the purple key and I have the nonces. So I'm just going to go ahead and send the message integrity code first. So instead of sending this in one message and then this in another message, I'm going to combine them and send them in one shot. Now, the access point at this point has its own nonce, right? Because that's its own nonce. It received the other nonce from the client, and it knows the blue key. So I can use blue and red to get purple, just like before. And at this point, I can now send this half of the message integrity code. And since both sides have now exchanged the message integrity codes, I am also safe to send the GTK, which is the group key, to the client. And at this point, everything's done, so I can act to finish it up. So I guess the authentication request doesn't quite count, but if you just count messages with actual content inside, instead of 6 from before, now you have 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you ever see the 4-way WPA handshake, the reason why it's 4-way is because I wanted to minimize the number of messages, but the protocol is basically the same. So I'm still using blue and red to get purple, and I'm still sending a GTK at the end. Okay, so this one to me is a little bit hard to look at because it's kind of asymmetric, right? Things are happening at different times. So things happen as soon as they can happen for efficiency. In my mind, the previous diagram was a little bit cleaner, but it's up to you. Okay, so that's WPA. I guess I can stop and see if anyone has any questions about it. Okay, apparently I have to refresh the slides so I can get the summary at the end, which was just created right on time. Okay, so let's talk about attacks. I hope. Whoa, that was a lot. Okay, I guess this was not animated, but yeah, there are a lot of different attacks on WPA. So the first one is called Rogue AP. Basically, kind of similar to the previous attacks. All you have to do is pretend to be an access point, and the person connecting will have no idea that you're not the actual access point. So again, because it's their first time connecting, they have no idea whether this is a real access point or whether it's just someone pretending to be the access point. So you can pretend to be the access point. You can give your own nonce to the client during the handshake. And now you can also become a man in the middle because the client will send messages to the access point, right, encrypted with the purple key to be sent forward. And if you pretend to be the access point and you create your own handshake, you'll know the purple key and you can decrypt messages that are meant for you before they get sent onwards. So yeah, I think that's it. Basically, the only requirement for being a rogue AP is you have to know the password because you have to be able to derive the purple key yourself, right? So remember, it goes password to blue, blue and red to purple, right? So you have to know the password to get blue, and you have to know blue to get purple. So to be a rogue AP, you do have to be on the network. But if you are, you can pretend to be an AP, and then you can become a man in the middle. The second one, this one's actually an offline attack. So you could try an online attack and just try different Wi-Fi passwords until it works. So I've definitely been over to like a friend's house and just try a random, or I'm like outside or something and I see a Wi-Fi network, I just try a couple common ones for fun. But online attacks are are easier to defend against because if you see someone, making 1,000 different password guesses, you can just stop them and be like, hold on, you're trying too often. So we saw that in password hashing and in memory safety already. Online attacks can be stopped because you require the access point to do some computation. And the access point can refuse to do the computation, and then you're out of luck. But with WPA, it's actually possible to do an offline attack. And the way this works is, first you notice that to get the purple key, right? I know we are going over this over and over again, but the purple key comes from the Wi-Fi password, which is how the blue key comes along, and the nonces and the MAC addresses. Well, notice the MAC addresses are public. So because you can see messages being sent across, the packets being sent across the network, you can usually see the headers and figure out, well, these are the MAC addresses of everyone. So you know everyone's MAC address if you're an on-path attacker and you're looking at the messages being sent back and forth. You also know the nonces if you're on path because the nonces have not been encrypted. They're just sent over the network. So if I know the nonces and I know the MAC addresses, the only thing I have to guess is the Wi-Fi password, right? So all I have to do as an eavesdropper is I guess a password, and I do this all offline by myself. So I take the password, I calculate blue. I can do this by myself because I know the algorithm. I take my guessed blue. So this is just a guess based on my password guess. I'll take the nonces, which I know are correct because they were sent over the network. I'll take the MACs, which I also know are correct because those are public. And I'll try a purple key. So this is my guessed purple key. I don't know if it's right. I just came up with it myself as a guess. But remember, there's also one other thing in the handshake, which is the MIC, or the message integrity code. So what I do now is I check that the message integrity code matches the message integrity code that was sent. So I use my guessed purple to generate the MIC, and I check if the MIC from my guessed purple matches the actual MIC that was sent. If they match, then I probably guessed the right purple key here, and I guessed the right password. If they don't match, then I probably guessed the wrong password, and I'll try a different one. So notice all of this was done offline. If I recorded the nonces and I recorded the MAC addresses and I recorded the MICs, I don't need the access point to do any computation for me. I can actually do this brute force attack myself offline. And that means I can try as fast as I want, as often as I want. I can grab a bunch of GPUs and parallelize it if I want. So this is very fast. And it also helps that a lot of Wi-Fi passwords are very poor. So people just use the name of their dog or password 123 or something. So you can actually brute force this and just try a bunch of common passwords. And usually it's possible to, if the password's bad, it will only take a couple of thousand or a couple million guesses before you find the right one. So that's the offline brute force attack. And I guess it's not quite an attack, but one thing to notice is that WPA does not have forward secrecy. So if you remember way back in crypto, forward secrecy is the property where I do some secure communication now. Someone records my secure communication. That's all encrypted and MAC'd and all that. And they have no idea what this encryption is now. But maybe sometime in the future, they have decrypted your key or they've compromised your key or something, right? So in the future, they attack you. And because the scheme has no forward secrecy, or if the scheme has no forward secrecy, they can actually go back and decrypt the stuff from the past. So that's what forward secrecy is. WPA does not have forward secrecy because if you record A nons and S nons, so you write them down now, then later, if I learn the password or I learn PSK, I can actually go back. I can take the password, which I now know, come up with blue, go from blue to purple. And because I recorded the nonces, I have those, so I get purple. And because I have purple, now I can actually decrypt past communications. So WPA does not have forward secrecy. And this is unlike something like Diffie-Hellman, which we talked about as having forward secrecy, because if they record G to the A and G to the B, they don't have G to the AB. Okay. So those are the attacks on WPA. I think sometimes it's called WPA2, sometimes it's called WPA PSK, because PSK is the name of one of the keys. So sometimes you see that. So these are the different ways you can attack WPA. Does anyone have questions on them? Yeah, the offline attack, I think, is the most unusual one here. It's kind of unlike the ones from earlier today. But again, if you understand how the colors come to be, then it makes sense. Okay. So the way to defend against these is actually just to throw out WPA2 entirely, which is kind of a funny defense. But the defense is say, well, WPA2 is kind of broken. People can do this funny stuff with it. So let's just ignore that and build a better WPA. So this is the new version of WPA called WPA Enterprise. The issue from before is basically everyone is using the same source of secrecy. So everybody had the same blue, right? Everyone had the same password, and it's the single password that comes with PSK. So if you record the information that's being sent over the network, and you have the password or you guess the password, you will eventually be able to get the keys, because the only source of secrecy is the password, and everybody is using the same one. That's the main problem. So the fix is, instead of everyone using the same password, because then everyone can derive the same purple keys, then let's have everyone use a different username and a different password. And in fact, if you use AirBears2 in Berkeley, so if you've ever been to Berkeley, use their terrible Wi-Fi service, AirBears2 is the Wi-Fi network, and it actually uses WPA Enterprise. And the way you can determine that the network is using WPA Enterprise is because AirBears2 asks you for a username and a password. That's something unique to WPA Enterprise, and it doesn't happen on WPA2. So if your home Wi-Fi network just asks you for a password, that's WPA2 or WPA PSK. If it's like AirBears2 and it asks you for a username, that's Enterprise. And I think, as the name says, it's mostly like companies that are using Enterprise or universities. Okay, so the way this works is let's no longer use the PSK, because the problem here was that everyone was using the same PSK. So let's actually use a different PSK per person. And the way we're going to get the PSK is to rely on another server called the authentication server. So this is a server sitting on the network, and its only goal is to give different PSKs to every person. So now we have to insert some trust, and to do this, we'll add extra cryptography. So you will accept a digital certificate from the authentication server to prove that this is truly the authentication server. So we'll see this more later, but basically the idea is I'll take the digital certificate to find out this is truly their public key. And then I'll find a way to ensure that they also have the private key that guarantees that they're the right person. So now I trust the authentication server. So we'll see this again later, so don't worry about it too much for now, but just assume that I found a way to use cryptography to trust this authentication server. Next, and again, we'll see this later, but we'll use a different protocol called TLS, which is next week, to form a secure channel to the authentication server. So I will securely communicate with the authentication server so that nobody else can read my communications. And I will send my username and my password to the authentication server. If those are correct, the authentication server will send a one-time key to both the client and the access point, and they will both use this key as the PSK, or the blue key. So now, every single time I log in, I'm using a different blue key that the authentication server has provided, instead of using the same blue key every time. Okay, and this definitely feels kind of like cheating, right? It's like, wait, to solve my problem, I'm just gonna find a magical secure channel and a magical digital certificate trust method. So it's kind of magic for now, but I promise you next week when we talk about TLS, we'll see how this works. But basically the solution here is to add an extra trusted server, and this trusted server will create different PSKs for every user, depending on their username and their password. Okay. And then the rest of the handshake is the same as before. So now that both of them have a blue, which is a different blue every single time, you use the blue, use the nonces, you get purple. and it's the same as before. And you exchange green or whatever. Okay, so now all the attacks from before are actually now no longer possible because the PSK is different every time. So let's see. Well, if I want to be a rogue AP, that doesn't work because in WPA Enterprise, all the APs must be verified by the server, the secure authenticated server, right? And if you're an attacker, the authentication server will say, wait a minute, you're not a real AP, so I'm not going to give you blue keys. I only give blue keys to real APs, and you're obviously an attacker. So the rogue AP attack no longer works. The brute force attack also doesn't work because not only do you have to generate to brute force the password, but you also have to brute force the PSK, the blue key, because the blue key is now different every time. So before, to figure out what the blue key is, you just guess a password and then use your guess to come up with a blue key. But now the generated PSK is random and very, very long every single time. So it's very hard to brute force, and in fact, probably impossible. And there is now forward secrecy because every time you use this generated PSK or this blue key, when you're done, you'll actually just throw it away. So even if someone compromises you later, they will not have the PSK to finish the handshake. Okay, so those are the attacks from before, and now you can see how they're all defended against. So again, the key here is using a trusted server, which we'll talk about later. You take the blue key, which used to be the same for everyone, and you swap it out for a different key every single time. And that solves most of your problems. Now, there are still some attacks that can happen after you connect to the network. So for example, after you connect to Wi-Fi, you may still have to request an IP address through DHCP, or you might still have to translate addresses through ARP. So those are still vulnerable because, yeah. Is WPA layer 1 or layer 2? I feel like it's 2, but maybe it's 1. So some of the protocols are kind of fuzzy, but I don't know. But yeah, once you connect to the local network, you are still on a local network. So the local network protocols like ARP and DHCP are still vulnerable. Okay. I think that's it for WPA Enterprise. So again, I guess there's no diagram, unfortunately, but the idea basically is just take the PSK thing from before, swap it out with talking to an authentication server. And yeah, I guess WPA is a little bit fuzzy, but you can think of it as kind of in between layer 1 and layer 2. The reason why some of these protocols are fuzzy is because the OSI layer model is like from 1970 or something. I didn't even know there was internet in 1970, but okay. It's very old. So some of its layer definitions are not, like they don't fit the modern protocols. So yeah, I guess WPA is kind of also layer 1 because it's transmitting data between you and the access point. But the main thing to notice here is just that ARP and DHCP are above WPA because they happen after you connect to a local network. Okay. So now we're on the summary. I've never looked at the summary slide before, so I'll try to wing it and we'll see what happens. So we started today by talking about the classes of attackers. So we said the off-path attacker cannot see or modify packets. The on-path attacker can see packets, but they can't modify them. And the man in the middle can also see packets and modify them. So those are the different classes. We also saw some examples of how you might become one of those attackers. So maybe you're the United States and you set a diver into the ocean and bug the cable. I don't know. Then we talked about a couple of different protocols. So there was ARP. The reason why ARP exists is because I want to translate IP addresses to MAC addresses. The protocol is pretty simple. All you do is just yell at everyone on the server and say, or the network and say, who has this IP? Anyone know? And the attacker can just lie and say, yeah, that's me. Here's my answer, even if it's not them. And assuming the attacker's response gets there first, and assuming that the attacker has lied about the answer, then the victim will accept the answer. So Alice says, who has this IP? Bob is supposed to answer, but maybe Mallory will also answer to the fake response. And if Mallory's answer gets there first, then now Alice will accept Mallory's IP address to MAC address mapping, and all the packets get sent to Mallory first. There are two defenses. One of them is switches. So ask a switch to forward the packets to the right place for you, or just rely on higher layers, or use ARP Watch, which is a tool for kind of seeing if anything suspicious is happening on the network. Then there's DHCP. DHCP is a protocol for a new client to receive a configuration. So the first time you ever connect, you have to figure out what IP address you want, where is the router, where's the DNS server. So the way you do this is kind of similar. You just ask anyone, say, hello, does anyone know? And whoever answers first, you'll just take their word for it. So again, the attacker can't respond with a malicious configuration. And there's no great defense because there's no trust anchor. So we'll use higher layers to defend against that in later lectures. And DHCP does have a 4-way handshake. So remember, you ask everyone for a configuration. Any DHCP server can answer you and say, here's an offer, or an attacker can give you an offer. And you pick one to accept, usually just the first one. And you tell everyone, I've accepted this one, right? Usually the first one, and usually the only one. And then at the end, the DHCP server gives you an acknowledgement and says, yes, everything's good. This is yours. And then finally, we talked about WPA, which I guess is a layer 1, layer 2-ish fuzzy, but probably layer 1 communication protocol to encrypt Wi-Fi communications. So on a Wi-Fi network, which is a wireless local network, you want to encrypt everything with keys. So the way the keys are encrypted is that big handshake from before. And things to notice about that handshake was you exchange nonces so that everyone has a different key every time. Use blue in the nonces, which are red to get purple. And at the end, you use a cryptographic MAC or a MIC to verify that everyone has the right keys and the right nonces. There are some attacks. You can pretend to be an access point. You can brute force the password after recording a handshake. This is an offline attack because you record the information and compute the guesses yourself and then see if you can compute a correct one. So that's all offline. And there's no forward secrecy. And finally, to defend against all those, you use a different version of WPA called Enterprise. And that uses a third party. So find another trusted authentication server that uses, or that provides a one-time replacement public key, or PSK, sorry. A one-time replacement PSK or a blue key. And instead of using the same PSK every time that comes from the password, now I'm going to use a different PSK every time for every user. And that will stop all these attacks from before. Whew. Okay, somehow, some way we made it. I think we're just out of time. Does anyone have extreme last minute questions? Okay, if not, stay tuned for Monday. We'll work our way further up the networking chain. And I think we're good. See ya.